Today I will tell a story that started with love but ended in betrayal. It will show how love can break a heart into pieces. Listen carefully. It can happen to anyone. Let's go. I never thought I'd be telling this story. Hell, I wasn't even sure I'd survive it. But here I am, trying to pick up the pieces of my life and figure out how things went so wrong. My name is Carl, and this is the story of how the woman I loved more than life not only broke my heart but nearly destroyed me completely. Liv and I were together for 3 years. 3 years of happiness, plans for the future, and what I thought was sincere love. But in the last few months, something had changed. Barely perceptible, but enough for me to start noticing. Liv had become distant. She stayed late at work more often, less likely to share her thoughts and feelings. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd smile her trademark smile and say she was just tired. "Carl, honey, you worry too much," she said, touching my cheek lightly. "I just have a lot of work to do. You know what an important project we have going on right now?" I nodded, trying to ignore the anxious feeling in my chest. Yes, I knew about the project, but I also knew that before, even during her busiest periods, she'd made time for us. For me. I tried to be understanding. I brought her coffee in bed in the morning, surprised her in the evening. Once I even arranged a romantic dinner on the roof of our house, with candles and her favorite music. "Oh, Carl," she said then, looking at me with a slight smile. "You never cease to amaze me." But in her eyes, I didn't see the excitement, the spark that used to light up at my surprises. Instead, there was something akin to regret. I couldn't figure it out, and it scared me more than anything. And then Jason showed up. My cousin, the man I'd always thought of as a brother. He had recently moved to our town and naturally became a frequent visitor to our house. "Hey, cousin," he exclaimed when I opened the door on the first night of his visit. "How about throwing a party to celebrate my move?" I smiled, feeling the tension of the last few weeks let go a little. Jason always knew how to lighten the mood. "Sure, why not?" I answered, letting him into the apartment. Liv came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, Jason!" she exclaimed with a smile I hadn't seen in weeks. "How nice of you to stop by." I was glad at first. Jason always knew how to lighten the mood, to make everyone laugh. And for a while, it felt like his presence breathed new life into Liv and me. The three of us spent evenings together, watching movies, playing board games. Liv was laughing again. Her eyes were sparkling, and I thought maybe things were getting better. But then I started to notice the stares. The way Liv laughed at his jokes a little louder than necessary. The way they could talk about a book or a movie for hours, completely oblivious to my presence. "Have you read Mitchell's latest novel?" Liv asked Jason one day. "Yes, it's terrific," he replied enthusiastically. I especially liked the moment when... And so they went on with their discussion, while I sat there feeling like an extra in my own house. I tried to convince myself that it was all a figment of my imagination. Paranoia brought on by work, stress, and insecurity. Liv loves me. Jason is my brother. They would never betray me. But the doubts were growing. Every time Liv said she'd be late for work, I couldn't help but think, what if she's with him? Every time Jason suggested we meet, I wondered, does he want to see me or her? I hated myself for having those thoughts. Hated the way they were eating me up inside, poisoning every moment the three of us spent together. One night, as we sat in the living room, I couldn't take it anymore. "Liv," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "why don't we go out together this weekend? It's been a while since we've been on a date." She looked at me with slight surprise. "Oh, honey, I'd love to, but I have a client meeting on Saturday, maybe next time." "Sure," I replied, feeling everything inside clench. "Next time." Jason, who was sitting next to me, gave me a sympathetic look. "Hey, cousin, don't feel bad. Why don't we have a guys' night out? Beer, sports, the whole thing?" I nodded, grateful for his attempt to support me. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the thought. Why didn't he suggest a threesome? Why is he so excited about being alone with Liv? As the days went by, my paranoia grew. I began to notice details I had previously overlooked. The way Liv started taking more care of her appearance, buying new clothes. How she was constantly checking her phone, smiling at some message. When I asked who the messages were from, she just shrugged. Just colleagues writing for work. But I could see the blush on her cheeks, the sparkle in her eyes. These were not work messages, or at least not just work ones. I started checking her phone when she left it unattended. Hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. Liv was careful, though. I didn't find anything compromising. My friends noticed a change in my behavior. "Carl, buddy, what's going on with you?" Mark asked me during our traditional Friday night meeting at the bar. "You haven't been yourself lately." I wanted to tell him everything, about my suspicions, about Liv's drifting away from me, about Jason's strange behavior. But I couldn't. To say it out loud would be to admit the reality of the situation, and I still hoped I was wrong. "It's fine," I lied, taking a sip of my beer. "Just a lot of work." Mark nodded, but I could see he didn't believe me. He didn't push, though, which I was grateful for. So one night I decided to surprise Liv. I bought her favorite wine, ordered dinner from the restaurant where we had our first date. I wanted to remind her of what we had. I wanted to bring back that spark that seemed to be starting to fade. I left work early, quietly walking up the stairs of our house, anticipating her reaction. I could already picture in my mind how happy she would be, how we would sit by candlelight, remembering our best moments. Maybe this night would change everything. Maybe we could get back what we seemed to have begun to lose. But when I opened our apartment door, I realized that all my worst fears were but a pale shadow of reality. What I saw changed my life forever. Liv was sitting on Jason's lap. They were kissing, passionately, greedily, as if they couldn't get enough of each other. Clothes were lying on the floor. His shirt, her blouse. The bag of wine fell out of my hands. The sound of breaking glass made them pull away from each other. "Carl!" Liv exclaimed, jumping up. You're early!" Her voice sounded surprised, but not guilty. There wasn't a shadow of remorse in her eyes. Only annoyance? Like I'd interrupted something important. Jason looked embarrassed, but not as embarrassed as a man caught in a betrayal should be. "Cousin," he began, "it's not what you think." I laughed, bitterly, hoarsely. "Not what I think?" I asked him again. "What am I supposed to think, Jason? That you're rehearsing a scene for amateur theater?" Liv took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed away. I couldn't bear the thought of her touching me after this. "Carl," she said in the tone she used to explain to me why I was wrong, "let's talk calmly. Like adults. Like adults." God, I hated that phrase. "Like adults?" I said it again. "Okay, come on. Explain to me as an adult why my girlfriend is fucking my cousin in our apartment?" Liv sighed, as if I were a naughty child who didn't understand the obvious. "It's complicated, Carl," she began. "Jason and we have a special bond. We didn't want you to find out like this." "How did you want me to find out?" I asked, feeling my insides boiling. "Maybe you were planning to send me an invitation to your wedding?" Jason stood up, pulling on his shirt. "Look, cousin," he said, taking a step toward me. "We didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened." I looked at him, the man I considered a brother. We'd grown up together, shared secrets, supported each other. And now he was standing in front of me, trying to justify the betrayal. "Don't you dare!" I gritted my teeth. "Don't you dare call me cousin! You're not my family anymore!" At that moment, I felt something inside me break. Not my heart. No, it was something deeper. The foundation of my trust, my faith in people. And I didn't know that this was just the beginning. That Liv wouldn't stop at simple betrayal, but would go much further in her lies and manipulations. I didn't know that I would not only have to endure the pain of betrayal, but that I would have to fight for my freedom and reputation. At that moment, I had no idea how brutal the continuation of this story would be, and how far Liv was willing to go to protect herself and her lies. The next morning greeted me with the silence of an empty apartment. Liv's things scattered around the rooms mocked me, reminding me of the betrayal. I was sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly into a cold cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Liv stood on the doorstep. Her face was pale but determined. Without a word, she walked past me into the apartment. "We need to talk," she said, turning to me. I stared at her, trying to understand how the woman I loved more than life could turn into a stranger in front of me. "What do we need to talk about, Liv?" My voice sounded hoarse. "You said everything yesterday with your actions." She sighed, as if she were talking to an uncomprehending child. "Carl, what you saw, it was a mistake. I panicked. But I love you and we can fix this." Her words, which yesterday would have made my heart beat faster, now only made me bitter. "Fix it?" I grinned bitterly. "How do you propose to fix betrayal, Liv? How do you propose to glue back together what's shattered?" Liv took a step toward me, but I backed away. I couldn't bear the thought of her touching me after everything. "You don't understand," she said, a hint of irritation in her voice. "I did something stupid, but it doesn't mean anything. What we have is more important." I stared at her, trying to see some shred of remorse, some shadow of the Liv I knew. But there was someone else standing in front of me, someone cold and calculating. "Doesn't mean anything?" I said it again. 3 years of a relationship, all our plans and dreams, and it means nothing to you? Liv rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Carl. You always make things so complicated. People make mistakes." Her words hit me harder than any physical blow. How could she so easily undo everything that had happened between us? "Leave," I said quietly, feeling something inside finally break. "Just go, leave." But instead of leaving, she did something I hadn't expected. Her face contorted with anger, and she grabbed the vase off the table. "You can't just kick me out," she shouted. "This is my house too." Before I could do anything, she slammed the vase into her hand. Shards flew across the floor and blood appeared on her skin. "What are you doing?" I rushed toward her, but she recoiled. "Don't come near me." Her voice shook, but her eyes remained cold. "You're crazy. I always knew you were a controlling maniac." I froze in place, not believing my eyes and ears, and Liv was already pulling out her phone, dialing a number. "The police?" Her voice now sounded scared and broken. "Help! My ex-boyfriend! He attacked me! I'm scared for my life!" In that moment, I realized that my life hadn't just changed. It was crumbling before my eyes, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to put it back together again. As Liv continued her performance over the phone, describing how I had allegedly assaulted her, threatened her, I stood there paralyzed with shock and disbelief. Her acting skills were impressive. Her voice shook with fear. She sobbed between sentences. And all the while, her eyes, cold and calculating, never took their eyes off me. When she finished speaking, she looked at me in triumph. "That's it, Carl," she said calmly. "Now you will listen to me." "Why?" It was the only thing I could squeeze out of me. "Why are you doing this?" Liv shrugged, as if it were an insignificant matter. "You left me no choice. I offered you a chance to forget everything, to start over. But you refused. And I can't let this story ruin my reputation." I looked at her, not recognizing the woman I'd lived with for 3 years. Where was the Liv who laughed at my stupid jokes? Who held my hand when my grandmother died? Who swore she'd always be on my side? "You can't just ruin my life like that," I said, trying to sound confident. But my voice shook, betraying my fear and uncertainty. Liv laughed, but there was no mirth in her laugh. "Really? What truth, Carl?" "Your word against mine. I have wounds. I have witnesses who will attest that you've been aggressive lately. What do you have?" I opened my mouth to answer, but at that moment there was a knock on the door. The police arrived faster than I expected. Looking at the approaching officers, I felt my world crumble. Everything I believed in, everything I loved, turned to ash. And standing there, in the apartment that was our home yesterday, I realized that I had lost more than just the woman I loved. I had lost my faith in people, in love, in justice. As I was led out of the apartment in handcuffs, the last thing I saw was Liv's triumphant look. And in that moment, I realized that my struggle was just beginning. A fight not only for my freedom, but for the right to believe in goodness, in love, in myself again. But at that moment, broken and betrayed, I had no idea how difficult this journey would be, and how many more trials I would have to go through before I could feel whole again. The days after my arrest became one endless nightmare. Out on bail, I found myself in a world that was suddenly alien and hostile. The apartment where Liv and I lived was now closed to me because of the restraining order. I found temporary shelter with Mark, the only friend who hadn't turned his back on me. Every morning I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that didn't go away all day. Thoughts of Liv, of betrayal, of the unfairness of the accusations haunted me constantly. I tried to keep myself busy looking for a job, but who would hire a man accused of domestic violence? Social media became a battleground for me. Liv's posts about surviving abuse garnered thousands of likes and supportive comments. My attempts to explain myself were drowned in a flood of angry messages and threats. I deleted all my accounts, unable to bear the torrent of hate any longer. The lawyer I managed to hire was not very optimistic. "Carl," he said, looking at me with tired eyes, "I'll be honest. The situation is complicated. We have no direct evidence of your innocence, and the prosecution has Liv's injuries and her testimony. We'll fight, but prepare for a long and difficult trial." I nodded, feeling hope slowly slipping through my fingers. The trial started a month after the incident. I sat in the audience, listening to Liv tell her side of the story. Her eyes were full of tears, her voice shaking. She spoke of years of hidden abuse, of my alleged outbursts of anger, of how afraid of me she had been all along. Every word she said was a knife to my heart. How could she lie like that? How could she undo all the good things between us? My parents sat in the courtroom, their faces pale and tense. I could see the doubt in their eyes, and it broke my heart. Could even they really believe these lies? The days in court dragged on endlessly. The prosecution witnesses our mutual acquaintances. Neighbors told of how they had noticed my aggressiveness, how Liv seemed frightened in my presence. I listened to their testimony with growing horror. Was I really such a monster in their eyes? Or was it Liv who had been manipulating their perceptions for years? My lawyer tried to refute the accusations, pointing to the lack of previous allegations of abuse, to my spotless reputation at work. But his arguments seemed weak compared to the emotional testimony of Liv and the prosecution witnesses. Jason, my cousin with whom Liv had cheated on me, didn't show up in court. My attorney tried to contact him, but he refused to testify, citing the Fifth Amendment. His silence was another blow, another betrayal. The press covered the trial with avid interest. I saw my face on the front pages, accompanied by screaming headlines. "Monster in sheep's clothing. Years of hidden violence." These phrases haunted me even in my sleep. Mark, a loyal friend, supported me as best he could. He sat with me nights when I couldn't sleep, listened to my fears and doubts. "We'll get through this, Carl," he said. "The truth always wins." I nodded, but with each passing day, I believed those words less and less. The financial problems came with a renewed vigor. My savings were melting away, going toward my lawyer's fees and everyday expenses. I tried to find some work, but was turned down everywhere. Who would want to hire a man accused of such a terrible crime? After 3 months of court hearings, I felt like a squeezed lemon. Every day was a struggle, with the system, with public opinion, with my own demons. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I really was that awful. Maybe I just hadn't noticed how unhappy I was making Liv. Sitting in Mark's apartment one evening, I came across an old photograph. Liv and I on the beach, happy, smiling. I remembered that day. We'd talked about the future, about kids, about the house we'd buy. How could we have come from that happiness to this nightmare? Tears ran down my cheeks. For the first time in all this time, I allowed myself to fully feel the pain, the anger, the despair. I sobbed, my whole body shaking, releasing the emotions I'd been holding back for so long. Mark found me in this state. He sat silently beside me, putting his hand on my shoulder. "You know," he said quietly when I had calmed down a bit, "maybe we should seek help." I looked at him incomprehensibly. "Psychological help," he explained. "Carl, you're going through hell. No one should have to deal with something like this alone." At first, I brushed the idea off. What kind of psychologist could help in a situation like this? But the more I thought about it, the more reasonable it seemed. I had to find a way to cope with this nightmare, or I risked breaking down completely. The following week, I made an appointment with a therapist. It was scary, opening up to a stranger, sharing my darkest thoughts and fears. But gradually, I began to feel relief. Therapy couldn't change my situation, but it helped me cope with the daily stress and find the strength to keep fighting. Meanwhile, the trial continued. The prosecutor demanded the maximum sentence, painting me as a cold-blooded manipulator and abuser. My lawyer tried to present an alternative version of events, but it was difficult without hard evidence. 6 months had passed since this nightmare began. 6 months that seemed like an eternity. I'd lost weight. I'd gotten gray in my hair. But I kept fighting. For my freedom, for my name, for the right to a normal life. There was still a long way to go. I didn't know how the trial would end, if I would ever clear my name. But I knew one thing. I would not give up. Even if the whole world believed Liv's lies, I would stand for the truth. Because in the end, the truth was all I had left. Every new day was a struggle against a system that seemed to be rigged against me, a struggle with public opinion, which had already reached its verdict. But most importantly, a struggle with myself, with the desire to give up. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew that I would continue to fight. For truth, for justice, for a chance to start my life again. And even if that fight took years, I was ready for it. Because the alternative, giving up and letting the lies win, was unbearable. It's been a year since the day my life was turned upside down, a year of struggle, despair, and slow, agonizing recovery. The trial was still going on, dragged on by endless continuances and legal maneuvers. I sat in a small apartment I'd managed to rent on the outskirts of town. It was far from the kind of housing I was used to, but now I was grateful even for that. I couldn't find a job. The stigma of being accused of domestic violence scared away all potential employers. I survived on occasional part-time jobs and the help of my parents, who, despite their doubts, did not abandon me. Therapy, started on Mark's advice, became my lifeline. Twice a week I saw Dr. Lane, an older woman with kind eyes and an iron will. She helped me sort through my feelings, dealing with the panic attacks and depression that had become my constant companions. "Carl," she told me, "recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. Every small step forward is a victory." I tried to believe her, even though at times it felt like I was treading water or even moving backward. The relationship with my parents remained strained. They supported me financially, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. One day, during a rare family dinner, my mom couldn't take it anymore. "Carl, honey," she began, nervously rubbing her napkin, "maybe you should consider a plea bargain. Plead partially guilty, get probation. That could end it all." I looked at her, feeling everything inside clench with pain and frustration. "Mom," I answered quietly but firmly, "I didn't do what I'm accused of. I can't plead guilty to something I didn't do, even if it means fighting for a long time to come." My father nodded silently, and I saw a glimmer of pride in his eyes. It gave me strength. Mark remained my mainstay. He not only provided me with temporary housing in the first months after my arrest, but he continued to support me in every way he could. He helped me look for part-time jobs, accompanied me to court hearings, and was just there for me when I needed to talk. "You know," he said to me one day as we sat in the park watching children playing, "I always thought I knew what injustice was. But what you're going through, it's opened my eyes. The system is flawed, Carl, but we won't give up." His words warmed my soul but couldn't fully dispel the darkness that had settled in me. Liv continued her campaign against me. She appeared on television, gave interviews, and spoke at conferences as a domestic violence survivor. Every media appearance she made was like a stabbing blow to me. How could she lie so convincingly? How could people believe her without knowing the whole truth? My lawyer, Mr. Greenberg, worked tirelessly. He tried to find inconsistencies in Liv's testimony, looking for witnesses who could corroborate my version of events. But it wasn't easy. Fear of public condemnation kept many people silent. "Carl," he said to me after another session, "I won't deceive you. The situation is difficult, but we have a chance. We just need to find that thread, pulling on which we can unravel this whole ball of lies." I nodded, trying to remain optimistic, though it was getting harder every day. One day, while going through old photos on my laptop, I came across a video of Liv and I. It was a week before that ill-fated evening. In the video, Liv was laughing, hugging me, telling me how much she loved me. I watched it and tears ran down my cheeks. How did we come from that happiness to this nightmare? I sent the video to Mr. Greenberg, not really hoping for anything. But a day later, he called me, his voice sounding excited. "Carl, this could be important. The video shows the jewelry around Liv's neck, the same jewelry she claims you broke during the attack. But according to her testimony, you broke it a month before the incident. It's a discrepancy, Carl. A small one, but it's a clue." I felt hope flicker in my chest. Small, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. The next court session was like a roller coaster ride. Mr. Greenberg introduced the video, pointing out the inconsistencies. Liv seemed caught off guard. She began to muddle through her testimony, trying to explain the discrepancy. I saw some of the jurors frown, looking at each other. But the prosecutor quickly took control of the situation. He started talking about how trauma can affect a victim's memory, how minor details can be erased or distorted. He urged the jury not to let this minutia distract them from the central fact, my alleged guilt. As I left the courtroom, I felt a mixture of hope and disappointment. We had taken a step forward, but victory was still a long way off. Life continued in its strange, distorted rhythm. I tried to move forward, even though sometimes it felt like I was just treading water. Therapy helped me cope with the daily stress, but it couldn't completely eliminate the pain and fear. One day, coming back from another part-time job, I saw Jason. He was standing across the street, looking at me with an unreadable expression on his face. Our gazes met, and for a moment I felt a surge of anger. This man could have made things right by telling the truth, but he'd chosen silence. Jason took a step in my direction, but I turned and walked away. I wasn't ready for this conversation. Not now, when every day was a fight for survival. Jason had always been more than just a cousin to me. Ever since we were kids, we'd been inseparable, like twin brothers separated at birth. Our mothers often joked that we must be telepathic because we understood each other half-heartedly. I remember our summer vacations at my grandmother's house in the country. Jason and I would spend hours in the woods, building huts and inventing incredible adventures. One day we got lost trying to find the pirate's treasure. It was already dark when we finally came to the road, hungry and scared. Jason squeezed my hand tightly then and said, "Don't be afraid, Carl. We'll always find our way home if we're together." At school, we always had each other's backs. When the local bullies tried to bully me because of my love of books, Jason always stood up for me, even though he wasn't the biggest guy himself. And I helped him with his classes, especially with math, which was hard for him. When Jason had problems with alcohol after his father died, I was there to help him through rehab. Sleepless nights, hard conversations, moments of weakness. We went through it all together. And when Jason got his first sobriety badge, he gave it to me saying, "It's because of you, brother. You saved my life." We shared everything, joys and sorrows, victories and defeats. Jason was the first person I told about my feelings for Liv. He supported me, gave me advice, even helped plan our dates. That's why his betrayal hit so hard. It wasn't just the betrayal of a cousin or a friend. It was a betrayal of a brother, a man I trusted unconditionally, a man I loved as a part of me. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life. I found a steady job in a small warehouse. The owner didn't care about my reputation. He needed labor. It was hard physical work, a far cry from my former career, but I was grateful for it too. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter. Interacting with dogs and cats in need of love and care helped me feel needed and distracted me from my gloomy thoughts. Gradually, some old friends began to come back into my life. They called, apologized for believing the accusations, offered support. I accepted them back, albeit cautiously. Liv's betrayal taught me to be more cautious in relationships. My parents, seeing my determination and resilience, became more confident in my innocence. Their support became stronger, more confident. This helped me to hang in there during the most difficult moments. The trial continued, and each session was a challenge. But now I had more strength to stand up to it. I didn't let Liv's accusations define me. I knew who I really was, and I was determined to prove it. It was a gloomy October morning. I was trudging down the street, returning from my night shift at the warehouse. 2 years had passed since the day Liv had ruined my life, but every morning I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, as if it had all happened yesterday. The drizzling rain was turning the city into a blurry watercolor. I lifted the collar of my jacket, trying to shield myself from the cold drops, when out of the corner of my eye I caught sight of a familiar figure. My heart skipped a beat. Liv. She was standing at the entrance to the cafe, glancing nervously at her watch. I froze, unable to move from my spot. For 2 years, I dreamed of confronting her face to face, of telling her everything that had come up. But now, when I saw her, all I felt was tiredness and dull pain. Suddenly, a man approached Liv. I didn't recognize him right away, but when he turned around, I caught my breath. Jason, my cousin, the man I thought of as a brother. They didn't notice me, absorbed in each other. I saw Liv smile at Jason, the same smile I'd once thought was just for me. They embraced, and there was more intimacy in that embrace than in any kiss. I stood dazed, unable to look away. They walked into the cafe, and I stayed out in the rain, feeling the water dripping down my collar. Something inside me snapped. All this time they'd been together. While I was fighting for my freedom and reputation, they were continuing their relationship. I returned home in a kind of fog. My thoughts were jumbled. My hands were shaking. I dialed Mark's number, not knowing what I was going to say, but needing my friend's voice. "Carl? What's wrong?" I could hear the concern in his voice. "I saw them, Mark. Liv and Jason. Together." He struggled to say the words. There was a pause. Then Mark said quietly, "Come to my place, now." An hour later, we were sitting in Mark's kitchen. He listened silently to my rambling story, occasionally pouring strong coffee into my cup. "What should I do, Mark?" I felt lost. He tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "You know, maybe this is our chance. Jason's the weak link. If push comes to shove, he might break." I shook my head. He already betrayed me once. Why would he tell the truth now? Because now he has something to lose. Mark leaned toward me. "Think about it. If this story gets out, his reputation will be destroyed. He risks losing everything." Mark's plan was risky, but it was the only chance. We decided that he would accidentally run into Jason and hint that he knew about his affair with Liv. The week of waiting seemed like an eternity. I couldn't find a place to be, constantly checking my phone. Finally, Mark called. "Carl, you're not going to believe this. Jason has broken down. He's ready to talk." The meeting with Jason was scheduled at my attorney's office. When I walked in, Jason was already there. He looked gaunt, dark circles under his eyes. "Hey, cousin." His voice shook. I nodded silently, not trusting myself to speak. Mr. Greenberg started asking questions, and I listened, feeling a storm of emotions building up inside. Jason told me everything, about how his affair with Liv had started, about how she planned to accuse me to avoid a scandal, about how she manipulated him into silence. "I'm a coward, Carl." He finally looked me in the eye. "I should have told the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid of losing everything. And in the end, I lost the most important thing of all, my honor and your trust." I looked at the man I once considered a brother and didn't know what to feel. Anger, relief, bitterness, all mixed into one ball. "Why now, Jason?" My voice sounded hoarse. "Why did you choose to tell the truth now?" He lowered his eyes. "Because I can't live a lie anymore. Every day I see you struggle, how you suffer because of our betrayal. I can't be a part of that lie anymore." Mr. Greenberg listened intently, taking notes. "Jason, do you have any evidence of your relationship with Liv? Messages, pictures?" Jason nodded and pulled out his phone. "I saved everything. I don't know why. Maybe part of me always knew the truth had to come out." The next few days passed like a blur. Mr. Greenberg worked around the clock preparing new material for trial. I was torn between hope and fear. The day Jason was scheduled to testify in court was unusually sunny. It was as if nature had decided to shine a light on the truth. There was dead silence in the courtroom as Jason began to speak. I kept my eyes on Liv. She sat with her back straight and a stony expression on her face. But I could see her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests of the chair. Liv's cross-examination was brutal. Under the pressure of the new facts, she began to muddle through her testimony. Her confidence melted before her eyes, and the jury noticed. After the trial, the reporter, Emily, who had covered the trial from the beginning, approached me. "Mr. Thompson," she began, and I noticed her nervously rubbing her notebook. "I owe you an apology. I was one of those who jumped to conclusions. I see now that the situation is much more complicated than it originally seemed." I stared at her, not knowing what to say back. For so long I'd been angry at the press, at everyone who'd believed Liv's lies, and now, hearing those words of apology, all I felt was tiredness. "Thank you, Emily," I finally said. "The truth has a way of coming to the surface sooner or later." That evening, I sat at home trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Standing on the doorstep was Sarah, my former coworker. She was one of the people who testified against me. "Carl, I came to apologize." Her voice shook. "I heard about Jason's confession. God, how could I have been so blind?" I invited her in, feeling strangely calm. We talked for a few hours. Sarah told me how Liv had manipulated her and the other coworkers by distorting the facts and eliciting pity. "I have to fix this," Sarah said firmly. "I will go to court and tell the truth about how Liv manipulated all of us." Her words gave me new hope. Maybe now that the truth was starting to come out, others would find the courage to take my side too. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night. My thoughts revolved around everything that had happened. I thought about Liv, about the love I'd once felt for her, about Jason, his betrayal and his belated remorse, about all those people who had believed the lie and were now trying to make up for their mistake. I knew there was still a long road ahead. Liv wouldn't give up without a fight, and I had many more challenges ahead of me. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I had a chance to clear my name, get my life back, and maybe help others who were in a similar situation. As I fell asleep, I thought about the fact that the truth, no matter how bitter, would always find its way out, and I was willing to fight to the end to see that truth prevail. Not only for my own sake, but for the sake of all those who might find themselves in a similar situation in the future. Tomorrow will be a new day, and I would face it with my head held high, ready to keep fighting. Because now I knew that even in the darkest night, there is a glimmer of hope. And sometimes that's enough to find the strength to keep going.